Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. 2016 was the year when hateful, divisive, and dehumanizing rhetoric unleashed the darkest forces of human nature. It was a year when those in power gave free rein to discrimination, particularly in Europe and the USA. So goes the foreword to Amnesty International's annual report on the state of the world's human rights. And joining me in the studio to discuss these issues is Mr. Salil Shetty, Secretary-General of Amnesty International. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Shetty. Amnesty International has been releasing these annual reports since 1961, and it's a London-based group. But this year, for the first time, you took this unusual decision to unveil the report in Paris. Why France? Why did you pick France?
Well, I think because the world is watching France. In some ways, France is at a tipping point. We've seen what's happened with the Brexit elections in the UK, and then, of course, the US elections are keeping us all busy with the headlines and all the news from there. So I think and we've already been concerned about the human rights situation in France because, it is absolutely the case that what happened in Nice and in Bataclan in Paris, left all of us shocked and horrified at the brutality. But the response from the French government, in our view, has been not just disproportionate, but also discriminatory. So the emergency laws which have been introduced, which gives sweeping executive powers to the government, has, I think really, if you look at what's happened on the ground in the last 2 years or so almost, that this emergency law, it's got extended time and again. 140 protests have been banned. More than 600 people have been put into confined, sort of house confinement. And the list goes on, and there have been very traumatic house raids which have happened. I always remember the words of this woman, Fahima, who had a 3-year-old child in her hands when, heavily armed French security forces, police come into the house. So she says, I'm still scared, middle of the night, So, of course, it's the job of the government to keep the people secure. The question is, how do you go about doing it? So many mosques have been closed. So you look at the disproportionality on the one hand. On the other hand, you think of, who are the houses? Who are the people whose houses are being raided? Who are these 600 people who are in house confinement? They're mostly Muslim. So it's difficult for us to, and of course you have to take action. But the other memory in my head, which I always think about, is this guy Antoine Leiris. I don't know if you remember. After the Bataclan incident, his wife was killed, sadly, inside that situation. But he wrote a letter, an open letter to the killers. And he said, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to change me. You're asking me to choose between freedom and security. But I refuse to allow that to happen. I will always choose freedom. So we believe that it's a time for the French government and the French people to stay true to the values. This country was founded on values of human rights, but look at what's happening already with the election campaigns. It's not just the National Front, which is, of course, putting up posters of homeless women saying you'd be better off being a migrant, and all the rhetoric, the hateful rhetoric that goes against Muslims and migrants. But our worry is even the other politicians. So we are watching the election rhetoric and platforms closely as well, and that's why France.
Right, because your message. And of course it's a huge tome, and you're covering a wide scope. But the central focus has been rather political. Coming out and criticizing Donald Trump's policies. I want to ask you: Do you also buy into this view that we are seeing the collapse of the multilateral liberal order?
These are words, right? Because then people use it in so many different ways. We go by action. So, of course, his campaign was full of divisive, hateful rhetoric against migrants, against women, and this is in other countries happening against LGBT people. But our main message from the report, it's not political, it's human. What we are saying is that this kind of politics of hate and fear is polarizing people, dividing societies, and the consequence is that, because what are these people doing? They're whipping up nationalistic, hyper-nationalistic sentiments, and the only way they do that is by scapegoating a group of people and saying, these are the other. And the consequence is that human rights is in a free fall. we've never in the last quarter century seen what we've seen in the last 1 or 2 years, that you have leaders and governments who can bomb hospitals, schools, funeral processions, and they get away with it. And this is, I mean, for us it's a violation of international humanitarian law, but it's a violation of humanity.
Right. But this focus on the U.S., there would be some who argue, but the U.S. has always put human rights, sacrificed human rights for geostrategic interests. I mean, the fact that we have Donald Trump in the White House, is that really got a bearing on the state of the world's human rights?
No, I mean, it's not, the US, of course, always gets a huge amount of attention simply because of its power in the rest of the world. So, what our big worry right now is, so if you take, for example, the so-called travel ban, which is really a veiled Muslim ban, first of all, it's unlawful because it's against the US Constitution itself, which is why it's been suspended. Secondly, it's inhumane because these are Somali Syrians who are trying to find their way to the US. And thirdly, it's just stupid because what he's ending up doing is making the entire world unsafe, not just the US unsafe, and making it also less prosperous. The argument is we're going to make this country more safe or make US safe and prosperous. It's quite the reverse. But is it only happening because of the US? No, but the implications for the rest of the world of US actions are very, very serious. You can imagine how this now empowers Sisi in Egypt, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Duterte in Philippines, Bashir in Sudan. So the actions of the United States are very important. Equally, the actions of France.
That's what I mean. Do you think that Europe is going to have to take on more of a burden now, given that civil society in the U.S. is going to be so consumed by the domestic issues? And is Europe up to the task, really?
But I mean, this is a challenge, right? Because Europe itself is at the crossroads. I mean, you look at what's happening. I mean, Hungary can just simply, abuse refugees and get away with it. I mean, France itself is massively failing in its own responsibility to accept refugees. They have agreed to take about 10,000 to resettle, and only about 2,000 have been taken. They've done a little bit better on taking some of the Italians and those who are stuck in Italy and Greece. But even there, they push back unaccompanied children. So, we have so it's one thing to point to Trump or elsewhere. We have to start at home.
Right. I mean, and you mentioned the refugee crisis because I looked at your report last year and it really focused on the refugee crisis. This year, the numbers seem to have fallen from the 2015 high. Would you say that that has been a success in policy for the EU?
I'm not sure which numbers you're talking about. If you're talking about the numbers who are
have reached
up,
Europe.
Yeah, reached Europe.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so more people have drowned in the Mediterranean this year. It's gone up to 5,000. So it depends. So the whole thing is about the EU-Turkey deal, which is how the numbers came down. But we have questioned this deal from the very beginning because from our point of view, and you can see what we've said in this year's report, by what standards is Turkey a safe country? We've had 36 countries in our report we've documented who have sent people back to countries where these people are at risk, which is the principle of non-refoulement, is a cardinal principle of the Refugee Convention, and we are brazenly violating it. And that's, the Australians are very well, they're pioneers in this, so they keep their numbers down. How do they keep them down? Anybody coming on the boat is sent to an island in Nauru or Manus, where they're living effectively, in large prisons for all practical purposes. So you can keep your numbers down, but are you meeting your values? That's the question.
I mean, two things that you mentioned. One is you saying that this is happening. They're breaching international conventions. Two, making a deal with Turkey, and you have a solid report on Turkey. The extent of the violations that is happening under Erdogan just goes on. But he keeps growing from strength to strength, which is my kind of quick question. What actually comes of this? You keep sounding the alarm, and autocrats go from strength to strength, and the biggest powers that you expect to uphold human rights are violating it.
Well, the key message coming out at the end, the main point we are making in our report is that governments and leaders are failing us in many countries. It's not true everywhere. By the way, Germany, you have Merkel, who's said, no, these are German values. We stand for it. We will accept 1 million refugees. It's the same with Trudeau and Canada. They've said, Harper was running the country for 8 years and he kept telling us Canadians don't like refugees, we don't accept it. And suddenly Trudeau comes and as if Canada has changed, So it's a leadership question. So I don't want to lump everybody together. But you're right that overall leaders are failing us. And Amnesty is a movement of ordinary people. So this is a time for anybody who wants to make a difference to tell our leaders, that even if you have lost your humanity, we haven't. So it's a time for ordinary people to come in the way of leaders who are abusing human rights, and to stand up for justice and truth. In the end, I strongly believe that truth and justice will prevail. It'll be a bumpy road, but that's where we have to head. So.
Right, because you do call for people's mobilization, but that's a huge onus to put on mobilization, on ordinary and as well as civil society, to create campaigns and to sustain them. You yourself have been doing this for so long. How do you go about doing it?
Well, that's a very famous statement made that, it's only small groups of people coming together who've ever been able to bring about lasting change in the world. So people should never underestimate the power that they have. And Amnesty, we always say, if you take something like the fight against ending death penalty in the world, when Amnesty started campaigning on this, we had only about 20 countries who were not executing people. Today, there are only about 20 who still execute people. And that happened primarily because of a strong, sustained campaign. You take a country like the Gambia, a small country in West Africa. If you and I were having this conversation even 3 months ago, and you told me that Yahya Jammeh, the lunatic dictator who was running that country for 22 years, would be peacefully pushed out of his role, his position, I would have said, you're joking, it's not possible. But it's happened. Burkina Faso, young people stood up and said, no, it's time for change. So, you can't fool everybody all the time, and it's vigilance of people that's going to make the difference.
That's all that we have time for, I'm afraid. But thank you for joining us at the Frans van Kath interview. And do stay tuned. We have news coming up.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.